Welcome, everyone, to the Working with Federal Partners to Fund Trails on Federal Lands webinar. The Oregon Trails Coalition is able to offer this webinar for free with some support from Travel Oregon. So thanks to Travel Oregon for supporting getting this information out to trail partners around the state. We are recording today's webinar. So if you missed something, we'll have that recording posted on our blog within a couple of days from now. We also want to invite our webinar attendees today to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you choose everybody as the option of who your chat is directed to, not just our panelists, but other participants will be able to see who is in the Zoom room as well. And that's kind of a nice sense to get a sense of our larger community who's here today. I'll just introduce a couple more things before I introduce our main speakers today. I want to let folks know that you can utilize the Q&A feature to ask questions to our panelists at any time. We will probably save most of those questions for the end of the webinar to make sure that we get through all the planned content, but we definitely encourage you to utilize that Q&A. We do anticipate having time to respond to questions today. And we will also work to share links to any kind of specific programs or anything that our presenters reference today. We'll try to share those links with our webinar recording. So if it's just a link you're looking for, we'll help with that with the follow-up and the webinar posting. And so with that, just want to talk a little bit more about some resources available. A few years ago, with support from the Bureau of Land Management, Oregon Trails Coalition put together this Ready, Set, Plan guide. I should say with financial support from the Bureau of Land Management, but also Zach Jarrett, who's here from the Forest Service, had also done a body of work that really informed this guide as well. And was a big help to putting this together. And so if you are newer to thinking about kind of the life cycles of trail planning and development, you might find this guide helpful. It also has some information specific to Forest Service planning processes and BLM planning processes today. And it just provides kind of a potentially helpful to you frame for thinking about where you are in the life cycle, kind of what the next step is for funding a trail or moving it forward through the process. So that resource is available on the Oregon Trails Coalition website as a free PDF guide that you can download. And with that, I'll stop my screen share and introduce our first speaker today. Zach Jarrett from the Forest Service. And Zach, I'll let you introduce yourself and your role at the regional office. Thanks for joining us.
Well, hey, thanks, Steph. And I guess it's officially afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody. My name's Zach Jarrett. I serve as the Regional Trails and Dispersed Recreation Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service for the Pacific Northwest region. So that's Region 6. It covers the states of Oregon and Washington. It includes about 25,000 miles of trails and about 1,700 trail bridges here in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, thanks for having me today. Just wanted to start by telling everybody a sincere, heartfelt appreciation for all the important work you all do to help steward the network of trails on U.S. Forest Service administered lands here in the region. You know, I mentioned we've got about 25,000 miles of trails. Every year, we, with the overwhelming support of partners and volunteers, touch about 12 to 13,000 miles of those trails. So whether it's deferred maintenance or annual maintenance or new trail construction, about 55% of that work is done by partners and volunteers. So again, we couldn't steward those important trails without your all's leadership and support. I just wanted to start kind of this presentation by saying thank you, and we appreciate all the important work that you all do. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about just kind of the overview of federal funding that is available for supporting trail maintenance, trail development here in the Pacific Northwest. And it really kind of falls into a couple of different categories. When we receive funds from Congress, it's what we will commonly refer to as appropriated dollars. So those are our recreation budgets. Those are our trail budgets that come in. Varies a little bit each year with what our final full year appropriations look like from Congress. You'll hear Forest Service staff talk about things in codes and in acronyms. If you ever hear us talk about CMTL, CMTL is our trails budget for the region. We get about 1.5 million sent to us every year to distribute to the forests. And that distribution is based on a formula. So we spread money based on two different things. One of those things is total trail miles that exist at a unit. And the other is annual visitation that that unit receives. So, you know, places like the Mount Hood National Forest, the Deschutes National Forest in the state of Oregon, where we've got high numbers of trails and lots of visitors, their distribution of our annual appropriation is going to be higher than, you know, areas where that's not necessarily the case. That money specifically is sent down to the forest to support maintenance activities. So annual maintenance, typically deferred maintenance to a lesser extent, and I'll get into the reasons why here in a second. So I wanted to call that out because that's really kind of the backbone of how we fund all of our annual work that happens across the units. And the second category of funding that you'll hear us talk a lot about, and that's probably a little bit more important or relevant to this group, is all of these soft dollars that flow into the agency. So you've heard a lot about some of these recent laws that have been passed within the last several years, Great American Outdoors Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, disaster relief funding to support post-fire recovery. These funds make up probably 7 to 8 times what our annual appropriations are to support trail maintenance activities across the region. And I wanted to call out a couple of those different funding sources and give you kind of an idea of the scope and scale of what those investments have been looking like over the last couple of years. I'm going to start with the Great American Outdoors Act. So you can remember back in 2020, under the Trump administration, GAOA, as we commonly refer to it as, was passed. And it was passed and it supports all of the federal land management agencies. David's here for the BLM. So the BLM is a recipient of those funds, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and of course, the US Forest Service. Each region receives a set amount of dollars every year to invest in high priority projects, specifically focused on recreation and access to important recreation sites, recreation areas, trailheads, trails, trail bridges, those sorts of assets. And the money is specifically earmarked for deferred maintenance reduction. So, you know, the way that plays out for trails, you can think of it in terms of if a trail has not been maintained, so annual maintenance, meaning, you know, tread repair, log out, brush out, you know, physical access to those trails hasn't been touched within the last 3 to 5 years. Those trails have moved beyond needing annual maintenance and have kind of been put into a deferred maintenance category. So every year the region competes nationally for a pot of money, and those funds are sent down to accomplish that work. Here in fiscal year 2024, the Forest Service received about 22 million in Region 6 to invest in those priority recreation assets, of which probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million is going directly to support trails and trail bridges. Here regionally, we retain a pot of those monies to make strategic investments in partner organizations to support that important work. And in fiscal year 24, we've got about 1.3 million to spread to trail partner organizations to specifically focus on trails deferred maintenance reduction, and another about 750,000 to support priority trail bridge replacement activities across the region. I mentioned that because the trail deferred maintenance pot of money is pretty unique to the agency across the region. We really wanted to invest in partners to increase the capacity of the agency to get out and implement that work. And we really wanted to provide an increased amount of funding so that partner organizations could scale up those activities in support of that maintenance reduction. We've got a couple of what I would call kind of our bread and butter trail partner organizations that receive that funding each year. In Oregon, it's looking like folks like Deschutes Trails Coalition, Trail Keepers of Oregon, Trans-Cascadia, and in Washington, it includes organizations like Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance and Washington Trails Association. But in addition to some of those regional partners that are, a little bit more equipped and structured to work at scale, so working across multiple districts, multiple forests, we also have about $400,000 that our districts and our forests compete for to support partner organizations that do work at kind of a smaller scope and scale. We're about ready to announce some of those recipients based on kind of a requests for proposals from the units, and we move that money typically through challenge cost share agreements with our partners. And I'll get into the mechanics of how we move money here shortly. In addition to GAOA, some of the other pots of money that I mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law has been pretty targeted at reducing some of the maintenance burden that we have at developed recreation sites. So mainly campgrounds, trailheads, visitor centers, assets that kind of meet some of those definitions. And then of course, we've got another, I would say probably $12 million available to support post-fire recovery related activities in areas that have been impacted by wildfires over the course of probably the last 3 to 5 years. Of course, a couple of years ago, the west side of Oregon burned pretty heavily on the Umpqua, the Mount Hood, and the Willamette National Forests. And those forests are working through funding that doesn't come to the region. It's tied specifically to those individual events, those individual fires. So, those forests have been working hard to identify and assess the conditions of the trails post-fire recovery, and really build out kind of a program of work to support some of those maintenance activities. So, a lot of that work is loaded in the front end in the assessment and evaluation of the condition. And here, I think moving into the next couple fiscal years, you'll see the agency moving forward and actually implementing that work, doing that maintenance on the ground. And I know investing in partners to accomplish some of that work as well. So those kind of highlight, I think, the major sources of investments that the region gets. I talked a little bit about, the dollar amounts that come to us. And then I kind of wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to talk about, how we invest in partners, the mechanisms that we have available to move those funds, and some of the processes that we use to get some of that important coordination work completed. So, you heard me talk a little bit about challenge cost share agreements. I've been kind of tracking the participants on this call. A lot of you all are probably familiar and or have challenge cost share agreements in place with the Forest Service. But really what that is it's an agreement that we enter into with either a state or a local municipality or a nonprofit partner, where we've got mutual benefit that exists, that we can make kind of a collaborative investment to steward our lands. And so, a lot of the times when we have trail partner organizations at the table, that connection is really easy to make. You all bring in a match. Typically, there's a match requirement of 20% for us to enter into that type of an agreement. And we show that through detailed financial plans, statements of work, schedules, timelines, kind of the typical process that you would think of a quasi grant that we hand out to our partners. Coordination for those agreements looks a little bit different depending on who you're working with and what scale your partner organization works at across the state. I guess in this sense, myself, I have a handful of different challenge cost share agreements that I program manage with partners that work at scale. So again, that work at forests or districts, multiple forests and districts across the state. So we look across those boundaries and we coordinate as needed. That investment looks different depending on the funding that comes in each year. And the work typically rotates depending on what I like to consider, a Venn diagram of, wise investments where we've got partners with capacity, where we've got Forest Service readiness to help coordinate that work, and where we've got mutual or shared priorities with where that investment should be taking place. So really at the center of that Venn diagram is where we typically make those investments. So yeah, like I said, I program manage probably 6 different agreements in the state of Oregon to move money. And then the districts and forests each independently have their own relationships where they go through a similar process to queue up the work, enter into those partnerships, develop financial plans, and implement the work at whatever sort of a schedule or timeline is developed with our partners. So I guess, you got a good understanding of the monies we have available, kind of an overview of the mechanisms that we use. And then I wanted to, end this by touching on just some keys, I think, for how to successfully partner with the Forest Service when looking to, bring that capacity to the table. Honestly, I think a lot of the success that we can realize is relational. Establishing really strong relationships with your local Forest Service units and or with the regional office to identify, again, where your partner organization priorities exist, where you have capacity to help steward some of those assets, and having that communication happening early and often is typically where we see, I think, the most promising prospects for shared investment and ultimately successful implementation. I also wanted to just bring into the room the 4-letter word of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. That's definitely a process that can slow down the agency's nimbleness to effectively move forward on a timeline that works for all parties. So typically annual and deferred maintenance, we don't have to go through NEPA. Some situations I think maybe are outliers where you've got deferred maintenance that the ground disturbance is going to require us to go through a NEPA analysis, but typically we are working outside of that NEPA process. So, but for new trail construction, where obviously some of these monies are able to be invested in, that can be a 3 to 5 year process. So, if you've got ideas, if you're working on strategic trail planning processes with those local units, just be mindful that the timeline can get bumped out. So if you're doing strategic, sustainable trail planning, for example, and you're in that process right now, you could assume that if it's pre-NEPA, you're probably not going to be implementing for anywhere from 2 to 3 to 5 years out, depending on the scale of the NEPA analysis and the type of work that you're going to be doing. I also wanted to mention kind of where we're at in the budget planning process in fiscal year 24. I think everybody's well, maybe not everybody's aware, but us federal employees are pretty keyed into where we're at with continuing resolutions and full year appropriations and just the budget planning process in general for the federal government. Our fiscal year starts on October 1st. And we, in fiscal year 24, have been working under what we call a continuing resolution, which is essentially a carryover of our fiscal year 23 funding levels until Congress can pass a full year appropriations. There's been a couple of rounds of continuing resolutions that have extended out that dependency on fiscal year 23 funding levels. It's been pushed out until March 8th. At which time there's going to be probably one of three things that's going to occur here in the next 2 weeks, at least for the Forest Service. So we're either going to get a CR extension to some undetermined date into the future. We're going to pass a full year appropriations, or we will enter into a government shutdown, which unfortunately has been the case several times within the last decade. I mentioned it because what it's been kind of complex this year with entering into either new agreements with trail partner organizations or modifications to existing challenge cost share agreements until we get a full year appropriations completed, especially when it comes to how we move our Great American Outdoors Act money. So GAOA funds, since they are annual projects that are selected, do not have the authority to be obligated when we have a continuing resolution in place. So what that means is that until we get full year appropriations, all of our agreements are at a standstill, and our start work dates with our partner organizations can't happen until we get a full year appropriations and until we have the time to get budget authority and work either new agreements or modifications through our grants and agreements process. So, we've been in this situation before, unfortunately, and what that looks like on the ground is a slight delay in being able to get those agreements processed, get the money into our partners' hands, and be ready to implement as we move into out year field season planning. So I wanted to bring that into the room because I know many partners here are probably in kind of that waiting pattern. And hopefully we'll get some resolution here in the next couple of weeks. But I feel for you because I know a lot of hiring decisions, a lot of our, project level planning timelines are having to be subject to kind of the unknown timeline that we're working under. So just a quick overview from my end. I'm happy to answer some questions if they're coming through in the chat. I don't know, I think Steph will have some time for Q&A on the other end, but yeah, we'll be on to answer those. And again, thanks for the time, everybody.
Thank you so much, Zach. And yeah, once again, encourage folks to submit questions at any time through the Q&A feature that you should see in your Zoom bar, and then we can get to those at the end. And I think it helps everyone out when people kind of ask some more kind of specific questions to get a sense of how all this plays with real life scenarios. So don't shy away from turning some questions over to today's speakers. And with that, I get to introduce David Moore with the Bureau of Land Management, Oregon, Washington office. I know David's going to share some slides with us, so I'll just keep chit-chatting while he sets that in motion. Or maybe I will run out of things to say while he sets that in motion, but that's what's happening right now.
How are we looking?
Great, we've got a clear visual. We're not in the full screen mode yet. Now we are. Looks great.
All righty. Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Zach. It's great to be here and a part of this bigger Oregon team. I've been doing this for about almost 25 years now for the BLM all over the Southwest. California and Northwest Oregon district for the last 8 years. I've been here for almost a year now, about 6, 7, 8 months. I'm Zach's counterpart over at the BLM. Zach actually used to have this job and many years ago. And I'm the BLM Trails lead for Oregon and Washington. Zach took a really excellent top-down approach. I kind of took this the exact opposite, and I'm kind of bottom up. So here we go. So basically, I thought I'd lay the foundation. I apologize to those of you that already know a lot of this material. You've already a successful partner and had lots of these conversations, but basically, in a resource management plan, what the BLM affectionately refers to as an RMP, one of those lovely acronyms that Zach discussed, we have what are called rec management areas. And the BLM has two types of rec management areas. We have special recreation management areas and extensive recreation management areas. The special recreation management areas are basically prioritized for recreation. So recreation gets top billing. Other resource issues, timber, nothing else, they're all subservient to recreation within those. And the extensive recreation management areas, the IRMAs, they're commensurate is the word they like to use. So basically everything's on an equal footing. You go through a lot of planning and you finally get to a point in the NEPA process where everybody's happy, which really means that nobody's happy at the end of that. And so for each RMA, that RMA gets an RMA framework, and that framework, which is also part of the land use plan, part of the RMP, which is policy, which basically determines how the lands within that document are managed. That framework calls out how the RMA, what's allowable and prohibited within an RMA. It identifies primary recreation use types like hiking, equestrian, mountain biking, river access, campgrounds, things like that. It can identify, basically prohibit things like shooting within that RMA, prohibit surface mineral extraction, which basically quarrying and things like that. In the Northwest, you get a lot of that kind of stuff with the timber harvest for road building. Can limit timber harvest activities within that RMA, which is also very important, not to impact trail-based recreation, things like that. And the reason I say all of this is because it's incredibly useful to establish these things as you're coming in to your conversation with your BLM counterpart. Whoever that BLM point of contact is, typically a outdoor recreation planner, but it can be a lot of different things. It could be a resource specialist, it could be a park ranger, whatever. And if you can sort all of that out, go through the RMP, or even discuss it with them, it kind of establishes that stable ground foundation to move forward from in your discussions for whatever your project is. And so basically BLM's moved away. Some of this is just anecdotal. BLM's moved away from the multiple use model in the last 5, 6 years, which was the one size fits all. You had equestrian, all non-motorized use on the same trails. That resulted in a lot of user conflicts. By going to the single use, single purpose trail-based recreation, we've basically cut down on a lot of those user conflicts and increased exponentially a lot of our partnerships, because now that partner group is seeing direct benefits to its use type from that partnership out on the trails. So basically, all that said, if the project you want to work on is within an RMA, and I'm speaking new construction more than I am maintenance, really, unless it's more of a bootleg type trail outside of an RMA. But your chances of getting funding and support, internal BLM support, are much higher if it's in a SERMA or an IRMA, one of those two RMAs. And then moving into partner source funding. Some of this, like I said, will be old news to some of you, but basically you're looking at grants, donations, etc. As Zach mentioned, it could be a bottleneck. but really NEPA is foundational to anything we do. BLM can't touch the dirt, can't move a shovel full without getting NEPA done first. And typically for trail-based projects, even if it's trailheads, infrastructure development, stuff like that, you're looking at an environmental assessment. There's an EIS above that. That's typically for incredibly complex projects. I've never seen trail-based projects caught up in an EIS. Most grants require NEPA to be done prior to even applying for them, so that's something else to keep in mind. You're going to need BLM support for that project and for whatever timeline you're hoping for. So really getting in early with your BLM counterpart is instrumental. I can't emphasize that enough. Figuring out what management constrictions there are through the land use plan, what NEPA's been done, site specific, what we call project level NEPA has been done, authorizing that. If it hasn't been done, you're going to be needing to plan these things out. Like Zach said, anywhere from 2 to 5 years. One thing I did forget to mention, BLM is traditionally only focused on RMAs. Recently, I saw a few names pop up here. There's some new outside projects outside RMAs, I should say, that outside contractors have been brought in to do NEPA, site design and layout, things like that. So there is some new flexibility. Speaking specifically for Northwest Oregon District, my previous district, there was a huge turnover in leadership, and the new leadership seems very open to that model. So that, as long as there's that external funding, which of course these are all externally funded, then they seem to be pretty open to having contractors do that NEPA and do that design and layout for these new trail-based projects, which it's a first in my career, to be honest with you. It's really, really a phenomenal opportunity to have that happening. That rec planner is going to have to get internal support from management and supervisors, everything else. Like, Zach talked about, you've got all these internal processes that you've got to hit along the way. And so if you're mixing and matching funding, things like that, just get out, as I said, get out as early as you can with your BLM counterpart on these projects. One of the partner source funding that's available to nonprofits right now is the Title II Secure Rural Schools funding. That window's open right now, closing April 2nd. The limits on that are a minimum of 5,000 with a maximum of 250K. In my career, I've worked with partners and had phenomenal success on building some pretty spectacular trails with this. That's a lot of money to go do business with, especially if the NEPA is done already. So like, again, check with your local office, see if they've got anything in mind, see if NEPA's teed up. If not, excuse me, these opportunities come around every few years. So start planning your project, working on the NEPA with your BLM counterpart, whatever you need to do to get that teed up. So next time this grant window is open, you're what we call shovel ready. You're ready to go ahead and just start throwing money at it and get the thing built. There's the RTP program, Recreational Trails Program. Oregon Parks and Rec runs this. It's based on federal fuel taxes. This program's split between motorized and non-motorized projects, 2-year grant cycles, application windows in the fall, awards are in late spring in the following calendar year. The ATV OHV program is the same way, grant program with OPRD, same time frame, same flow there. Travel Oregon, I saw some Travel Oregon folks here pop up, some local chapters. They can be very generous to trails projects if they see that benefiting the local tourism for the gateway communities. So work on those relationships, work with your local BLM representative to identify those projects and those gateway communities, and the local visit whatever it may be, Corvallis, McMinnville, whatever, visit Salem, Travel Oregon folks, and start working on those projects. Even phasing them in. Phasing is another great way to get these projects done too. You do NEPA on one grant, you do design and layout and early stages, maybe staging in a trail or two at the second phase and continue on through that. Polaris Trail grants, they're typically about $10,000. Those are continuously open for application. Those are motorized only. People for bikes, they have e-bike specific grants. I'm not really familiar with this program. I just looked it up really quick and threw it on there for folks. But any project that benefits e-bikes, it looks like they're $5, $10, $15,000 willing to throw some money at a quality project that benefits e-bikes. With BLM source funding, a lot of what Zach said applies. With some caveats in here, I'll identify along the way. The BLM has, I won't waste everybody's time by discussing the ONC Act and the BLM's mandate to continuously and sustainably harvest timber, but that results in funding for the counties in which the timber harvests happen. And so an internal nickname for that funding when it gets redispersed from the Washington DC office back down to BLM Oregon for those counties is rec pipeline funding. I'm just mentioning it here, so when you go to talk to your BLM counterpart, you can just say, hey, is there any opportunities for us to get some rec pipeline funding for one of the out years coming up, 1 year, 2 year. Typically, those projects are identified and submitted in August. So you want to start your conversation at least around the new calendar year. Then you can identify any NEPA. One thing I neglected to mention earlier is there are some programmatic NEPA documents in place. Zach mentioned this as well, where all trail maintenance and reroutes within a certain corridor have already been identified and cleared via NEPA, programmatic NEPA. And so if you've got some reroutes to do and there is programmatic NEPA in place, you can go out and get some of these smaller bits of funding to go ahead and work on these projects. Unfortunately, a lot of that ends up being the rec pipeline funds end up being used to cover off staff shortfalls and deferred maintenance. It's just the nature of that beast. But I have also managed to get $20,000, $30,000 occasionally earmarked for specific projects. So that's always something to bring up. FLREA, Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act. That basically, the short version of that basically identifies if there's a business plan for a site, that site can charge fees. Within the last couple of years, BLM just started charging fees at those sites. Those funds need to stay local for staffing and deferred maintenance and maintenance projects. So and improvements, sorry. So a lot of times that ends up just covering basic parking lot and restroom cleaning and wages and stuff like that. But it's worth asking. You never know. I won't bother you with the funding code on that one, but if you just talk about the FLREA funds, they'll know what you're talking about. Rec Enhancement Act. Sometimes the site will generate a lot of funding and there'll be some left over for project specific, new trails, new reroutes, whatever. The bipartisan infrastructure law bill that Zach talked about, BLM, I am not aware. This would be something you definitely want to bring up with your local BLM staff contact. The BLM projects are all pretty high level contracts, habitat, watershed restoration projects, seed collection, stuff like that. So I'm not really aware of any way for you as partners to become involved with that. Great American Outdoors Act, GOA, the BLM, like I said, unless you're aware of something locally, I'm not aware of at my level. So much of the BLM's infrastructure in Oregon was burned over with the fires in 19 that a large portion of that money is going to basic infrastructure reconstruction. If you're familiar with Fisherman's Bend, Little North Fork of the Santiam, stuff like that, all those sites, all the infrastructure burnt, every last thing burnt. So a lot of that funding is going towards that, other parking lot, trailhead improvements as well. So like I said, check with your local office. There may be something I'm not aware of. And if you don't have a local contact for any of this that I'm talking about, feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with somebody at one of your local offices. Just like we've mentioned above, RTP grants, same with BLM. I'll discuss financial assistance agreements here in a minute, but BLM can get some of these external grants as well if your organization isn't capable of applying for and or managing these funds. BLM can, if there's the bandwidth with staff's time, the BLM can also apply for these grants and then use a financial assistance agreement to get that work done with you as a partner, either through volunteer work and reimbursements, or also subcontracting is a beautiful model. You can find a contractor and then pay them, you get reimbursed by the BLM. It's a really great model. I mean, you can do that with hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'll discuss the financial assistance grants here in a minute. The Yamaha Outdoor Access Initiative grants, another motorized option. Typically the BLM needs to apply for it, but it works much better with partner support. And we are in that application window right now, ending March 31st. Since this is being recorded, you guys can go back to the video and see the links I've put in here to all these, but if that's, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'm happy to share this presentation with you too, with all the links. One of our primary challenges, I'm just gonna say the quiet part out loud. One of our primary challenges as an agency is getting contracts obligated. There's usually 3 to 5 times more contracts that need processing annually than we have the capability of processing, even if we reach out to our National Operations Center in Denver for support through other contracting officers to help process. So where a project you're working on with contracted work with BLM, if they're trying to get that contract obligated, sometimes it might be a 2 or 3 years out before that project rises high enough to get processed in their criteria. So that just is what it is. I'm happy to discuss that further. It's just the reason, one of the main reasons for financial assistance agreements. This is an incredibly efficient way to get work done with partner groups, volunteer partner groups. And really, it allows the BLM to partner with you on, I mean, in our specific case, trails and development around trails. It is a binding agreement, and partners, like I mentioned above, can do these tasks, sub out that work, and then get reimbursed for that work. Say, so like let's say BLM works with you, you work with BLM on this project, NEPA's done, you're developing a trail, BLM applies for an RTP grant, several $100,000, and puts that money into the financial assistance agreement with you as the partner on that agreement. You perform the work, you sub out, say $200,000 worth of it. You just get reimbursed, you pay that contractor, work done, everybody wins. You can also have club members do volunteer work. It's a really win-win because then they're getting great experience, not only managing those funds and participating in the wonderful bureaucracy that is the federal government through the financial assistance agreement at grants.gov, but it's just a much more efficient way. There's no bottleneck with BLM contracting. Financial assistance agreements are 3 years initially with a 2-year extension possible right now. So that makes a total of 5 years. Once they're in, I've never seen one not get renewed for the final couple of years. That the total amount moves all over the place for where that approval needs to come from. Right now, $500,000 financial assistance agreements are approved locally. So there's no need. During previous administrations, we've needed to go all the way back to Washington, D.C. for anything $100,000 and over, or department level approval for those assistance agreements. And that's a very lengthy process. So right now we're in like the sweet spot for financial assistance agreements. Those are advertised to the general public through notice of funding opportunities. And right now, the state office where I work has 2 master NOFOs. One is the training financial assistance agreement, and the other is just for recreation general, and that'd be a great place to do direct contracting without a training component to it. That training financial assistance agreement, we're in partnership with Oregon Trails Coalition, basically calls out any work done under that FAA needs to have a training component. So that's one of your options as a partner. I could speak more to that offline or in the Q&A after this if anybody's got any questions. And if neither one of those 2 master FAAs that are managed at the state office level work, you can work with your local office to write a small one particular to your project. That's another great way to get something done specifically. If it's just got very unique needs and you need to work through unique funding, unique project, everything else, unique partner, whatever it may be. So the current Oregon Training Financial Assistance Agreement, Steph asked me just to speak to this briefly, was just signed this fall with Oregon Trails Coalition. Like I said, it's training focused. It's provided, I don't have the exact numbers, Zach's way better at that kind of thing than I am. But it's provided hundreds, if not thousands of hours of training for everything from trail construction and maintenance, bridge construction, SAW certifications. I was the direct benefit of that at Northwest Oregon District, and CPR first aid training. It's a great tool to take advantage of, especially for local clubs, local chapters with the SAW certs and CPR first aid, but also to gain valuable skills with the trail work, bridge construction. I know TKO, Trail Keepers of Oregon, is getting ready to work on a project out of Wildwood doing the boardwalk replacement out there. So that's another great project to get involved in. If you've got specific local training projects, excuse me, like I mentioned, reach out to myself and or Steph, and we're happy to work with you to figure out a way to get this training financial assistance agreement working for your trails. And thanks a bunch. Seriously, none of this would happen without you. BLM is fully reliant upon you as partners to make any of this happen anymore in a good way.
Thank you, David. I'm gonna return to sharing my screen to just introduce a few other things I want to share real briefly before we go to our Q&A. Another program I wanted to introduce that doesn't have a cycle that is open now, but is the Federal Lands Access Program. And this has been used to successfully fund some large, expensive trail projects. One particularly of note is the Historic Columbia River Highway trail project. Several segments of that trail project have received flat funding. It's a really big grant that takes a lot of time to put together. So it's good that there isn't a cycle happening right now. If you're just learning about it right now, you can start working with your federal land managers on what a future application might look like. We also had a question in the chat about some of the other funds coming through partners. American Trails has both a trail capacity program and a legacy trails program, and those are both partnerships with the Forest Service. So if you have Forest Service projects, you can look at this, and they operate nationally, so you're competing with projects all over the country. But the next opportunity with them will be in the Trails Capacity Program, which can fund stewardship, which sometimes can be the trickier thing to fund with grants. So keep an eye out on that program to reopen this fall. We also had invited National Forest Foundation to participate today, and they were unable to, but they wanted to share kind of their tips for working through cost share agreements and thinking about how that works, as well as their matching awards program, which will have a new that's again another one to keep an eye out for. I think they're going to open a new cycle, I believe, this spring sometime. And so that's another potential source to look at for national forest trail projects and stewardship projects. David mentioned our statewide trail skills training program. I just wanted to share, we have some general funding in that program that can support first aid CPR for BLM volunteers all over the state. And then we have some other sources of funding in that current grant for 2024 that are tied to kind of specific types of lands and monuments, et cetera. So best thing is just to reach out to David or I to find out if you have a trail project that has a training component. We may have funding in the current program to fund that, or this existing grant could potentially also be a vehicle to just move local funding identified for your project more easily and quickly to your organization or to that project. So we would love to work with you on whether or not that's a fit for that program. And lastly, as I thank I don't need to do it before I thank our presenters, I can thank our presenters and share that just last week we hosted a more general Trails Funding and Assistance Opportunities webinar, and that recording is up on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog already. That goes into a little bit more detail about some of the programs today's presenters referenced, like the Recreation Trails program and a lot of others, some of which are eligible for funding trails on federal lands, and others are specific to local lands or other scenarios as well. But wanted to let folks know there's some more information there. And with that, I will stop my screen share and go to some of the questions that were asked in our Q&A. And one question was about Title II funding and what folks can do to understand what those funding cycles are, or know kind of when those happen in Oregon.
You know, and I tried to answer this in the Q&A, and maybe it didn't log it, but I'll be the first to admit I'm not a Title II funding expert, but based on my understanding is that we've got resource advisory committees that are established across the state, and those represent kind of subregions across the state. So there's like a Northeast Oregon RAC committee that gets a percentage of Title II funds from the feds to make decisions about how are they going to invest those project dollars. And so, my understanding is that each one of the RACs has somewhat of a unique process and timeline associated with project solicitation and process for making funding decisions. I do know the BLM has a central repository through some of their tracking systems that people can go to see those timelines. I'm honestly not certain if the Forest Service has anything similar, but I can track that down and maybe share that out with Steph so that she can get it out to folks. But that's just my kind of murky recollection of what's going on. David may have something a little bit clearer.
Yeah, not a lot that I'm trying to find that link. I'll just post it in the Q&A there in the chat. Basically, it takes you right to the site, BLM site for the Title II funds. There we go. But I think I saw somebody asking if NEPA needed to be done prior to application, and yes, pretty much that's a pretty hard yes for anything. they may have changed things a little bit. Where you can be a certain percentage way along in the NEPA process, but I'm not aware of that, where you can still apply with land manager certification that you are moving along. So that link there will take you to all things BLM, SRS grants, and the application to the site and everything else.
Great. And then we had a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if this is what the poster specifically wanted to know about, but in terms of a lot of the funding mechanisms that were discussed today, you know, there's not necessarily kind of competitive funding opportunities related to them for groups. And I guess if you just want to maybe speak a little bit more to what's the best way for folks to, you know, if they know that, oh, possibly, you know, this is a deferred maintenance project, maybe it's a good fit for GAOA. What is the process for them to know kind of when, you know, how, you know, even though those aren't competitive funding cycles and there's a grant to go apply for, kind of how do they know when to talk to local unit folks, when those decisions are made, kind of what that process is?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steph. And I think I kind of alluded to this when I was kind of giving my overview. You know, a lot of the partnership investments that the Forest Service makes is driven by relationships. And, you know, there's inherent, I think, goods and bad that come with that. So I think it's critical that, you know, you start the conversation. Again, and depending on the scope that you're working at. If you're working at a district level, or if you're working, you know, across multiple districts on a forest, you know, communicate early and often with your contacts with the Forest Service. You know, we fund multiple trail partner organizations every year, and I feel like we're doing a really good job with folks that we have those relationships with. But if you're an organization that's maybe up and coming, knock on the door of your local Forest Service office and, you know, establish those relationships and have that conversation about, you know, what your priorities are and what sort of capacity you could bring. Yeah, the same fold. If you're a partner organization that's working at scale and working across multiple forests, then feel free to reach out to me directly and we can have that conversation. You know, in addition to some of the funding opportunities that I highlighted, that mainly GAOA I'm talking about right now, where we've got regional office funding. You know, we've got forest level project funds that they were submitted, and, you know, they may be multi-year awards, and so they're looking to make those investments every year. We've had difficulties, you know, hiring seasonal trail crews, and so what you're seeing is the Forest Service relying more and more on trail partner organizations to fill that gap. I mean, just this morning we had a conversation with the forest in Washington with a partner that works across both states, who's looking to move some recreation conservation office money that they got from Washington State that now is probably going to be going to one of our partners that works at scale because of some of those issues. So yeah, we've thought long and hard about, you know, how do we reach a broader audience that, you know, we may not have a relationship at this point. So you may see some changes on the way we do business in the future, but yeah, I'd say just start with those relationships, make those contacts, reach out to me if you need, you know, help connecting the dots. I'm happy to put you in touch with the local Forest Service staff that may be able to point you in the right direction.
And then we're right about at time, but if we can sneak one more question, and we have a couple of questions about funding NEPA processes or funding kind of outside contracting of NEPA, and both how a group can go about determining what those costs would be for getting a NEPA executed, and if anyone has thoughts on resources or specific grants that would fund that work.
Yeah, Third-party NEPA can be tricky in the sense that, not every NEPA document or process is created equally. It really depends on the scope and scale of the analysis and, the project purpose and need that'll define the cost. But I think we could probably come up with some fairly accurate estimates based on, third-party NEPA contracts that we've done in the past. I don't know that we necessarily as an agency have like a central repository where we're keeping track on those estimates, but I think with enough digging, we can probably come up with something that is in the ballpark. So again, if you're having that conversation at the forest level and just you're running into some roadblocks, again, feel free to reach out to me and I can do what I can do from my level to help maybe shed some light on those potential costs. Forgot the second part of the question though, Steph. What was that?
Just if anyone knows of sources that fund that specifically, as so many grant programs require the NEPA to be done in order to apply for funds.
Yeah, that's another good question. We know that there's funding gaps in supporting trail projects across the state. I would say third-party contracting for NEPA is definitely at the top of that list. Where I've seen success is fundraising opportunities. So getting people to fundraise, for that type of work, which is, it's honestly also pretty tricky because you're not fundraising for something tangible. You're fundraising for a process that may yield a result that actually is an implementation based on the results of that NEPA process. So it can be a hard sell, but yeah, we've seen some success with trail partner groups in Washington State, leveraging some private donations or investments in that work.
I will say that some of the programs we covered last week do support some planning and feasibility activities. Sometimes travel organs funding mechanisms, Federal Lands Access Program can sometimes fund some planning and feasibility pieces that might either be include part of NEPA or like even the scoping to get to NEPA to determine what the NEPA needs to look like. So there are a few resources out there, but it is a gap for sure. It is a bottleneck.
I wanted to answer real quick to Zach briefly discussed the like the quotes, figuring out how much it's going to cost to get NEPA done and things like that. The few projects I've been involved in lately, you basically worked with the local field offices, the sponsoring the project. You find out what sort of hours they ballpark it to take for each resource specialist, and then you can take it to the contractor from there, and that can kind of get you in the neighborhood. So, and then as far as I'm not sure, I can't speak to it now. It's been quite a few years, probably 6 or 7 years, but RTP grants used to have a planning component that you could apply for as well. I'm not sure if they still do, but they used to. So.
All right. Well, we are a little bit over time, so big thanks to our panelists. Thank you, David and Zach, for joining us today and for sticking around to answer some questions. We will post this webinar recording along with the links that were shared in presentations and discussed today on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog. We'll have that up by the end of this week. So thank you, everybody, especially again to our presenters, but also everyone who joined us today for all of your work on trails on federal lands. Really appreciate you all.